Hi, you're listening to Thrive in the Word. Now, Thrive in the Word is a study, a verse-by-verse study through the Bible. And today we're in the book of 2 Peter again. We're in the first chapter, and today we're gonna look at verse number 9. But again, I just want to say to you, it's so important that you go back and you listen to the other videos. Now these videos are very short. They're 8 minutes or 8 minutes and a few seconds long, and they're short. And the reason why they're short like that is we don't want to tell you everything we know about this verse. We want just to give you enough so that you have a foundation on which to base your thinking upon. I hope that you take these videos and that you meditate on them. I know there are several people that listen to them on their way to work. They listen to them as their devotion. And you know what? It's really made to be a foundation for your thoughts and meditations throughout the day. So we're in verse number 9 of 1 Peter. Now, in order to understand verse number 9, because verse number 9 says, those who lack these qualities, that's the way the verse begins. And so we need to ask ourselves, what are these qualities? Well, we find these qualities beginning in verse number 5. He says faith, moral excellence, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. Those are the qualities that Peter is talking about. Now, in verse number 8, Peter says you, and when he's talking about you, he's talking about the Jewish church. He says you have these qualities. Now, I believe that we can look at that in two different ways. We have those qualities because we are in Christ. Those qualities are all available to us. But I believe Peter also realized that the church that he's writing to, or the churches that he's writing to, that these people are already exhibiting these qualities in their lives. But now we come to verse number 9. And he says, he who lacks these qualities is blind and short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins. Now, what is Peter saying? He's saying that if a person lacks these qualities, in other words, if these qualities, these moral qualities are not present in that person's life, then Peter says two things. He says they are blind. Now, when he talks about blindness, he's talking about the total absence of sight, the total absence of sight and of knowing what's going on around them. And so he says that those who lack these qualities, and we need to understand that when a person lacks moral qualities, even though that person can be born again, going to heaven, if they lack these moral qualities, then they're blind. They can't see. And then Peter goes on and he says this, and he says, and are short-sighted. Now, when he talks about short-sighted, he's not talking about they can see only in short distances. He's talking about that they are lacking in an area of being able to see. Not just short, it could be they could be long-sighted, but do you understand what he's talking about? That they have limit in their sights. Now, what is limited? What are they not seeing? Well, that brings us to the next verse. Having forgotten the purification from his former sin. What does this lack of moral character do? It brings a person to the place where they're either totally blind to what Jesus has done in their lives, or they are just very short-sighted. They're very limited in their sight of what Jesus has done in their life. You see, Peter's writing to believers. He's not writing to unbelievers. He's writing to believers. And he's talking here about believers who are short-sighted. In other words, he's talking to Christians who have allowed their morals, their characters to decay. They haven't allowed the grace of God to come in and change their lives. And so they're walking around and they're experiencing moral decay. There's no godliness in them. There's no moral excellence. There's no knowledge. There's no faith, brotherly kindness, or love. And these people are lacking in those areas. Well, what happens? What happens is they lose sight of what Jesus did for them. Now, we can look at this in two different ways. One of the things that I think is extremely important is that believers realize how bad they were before they came to Christ. You see, many times people, they come to the Lord and Jesus does his purifying work in their lives. But because they don't continue in that purity, they don't continue to build character, and then they begin to regress or go backwards, then what happens? They lose sight of what they were like before Christ. You see, I believe it's a healthy thing not to come under condemnation and guilt. That's a whole different ball game, if you can use those words. It's a whole different place. But to realize that we, before Jesus, were totally depraved. We had nothing good to give to Christ. And you know what? When a believer becomes a Christian, but they don't allow these moral characters to be added to their lives, to be supplied into their lives by the grace of God, when they get to that point, you know what? They lose sight of what Jesus did for them. But they also lose sight of all the benefits of the cross. You see, it's good for us to know who we are in Christ. It's good for us to know those scriptures and be able to repeat those scriptures, that we are no longer under condemnation and that we are a new creature, and all of those scriptures. It's good to know that. But if you haven't allowed those scriptures to get into your heart and change your character, you know what happens? You lose sight of that condition that you've received because you were in Christ. You start allowing guilt and condemnation to come back into your life. You start allowing all the old things that used to dominate your life. You start allowing them to come back. Why? Because you did not continue to supply to your life all these moral characteristics that are mentioned in verses 5, 6, and 7. So I want to encourage you today. Continue on. Continue to add these things to your life. Because if you don't, you're going to go backwards. You know, you need to understand there are no neutrals in our spiritual walk. And I believe that's what Peter is talking about. There are people who didn't continue to supply, didn't continue to add these things to their lives. And now they have regressed to the point where they forgot about what Jesus did for them. Now, until we speak to you again, our prayer for you is that God will take these words and allow them to penetrate your heart so that he can change your life.